One of these days, I'm going to get over whatever this is. Today is not that day, though, so I sound worse today than I did on Sunday, so it is what it is. So, but hopefully the microphone will work. The full allotment tonight. It ran out on me there the last on Sunday night, but new batteries tonight, so it should be good. Be turning, if you would, to Luke chapter 7. We've spent the last couple of months talking about miracles of Jesus, and we'll continue with that here this evening. We'll be talking about the widow's son being raised. This is the widow in the town of Nain in Israel, and that's where we'll be focusing on here this evening. One of the things, I've had this conversation with Dad a few times, but one of the things when we talked about miracles is there's not a lot of meat on the bone, as it were, for these miracles. It's usually just, if you've noticed, 4 or 5, maybe 6 verses, and in some cases, it's only told in one of the 4 Gospels. Some of them are 2, and some are 3. We're getting almost nothing out of John for these so far, and so kind of find ourselves when looking for something to sort of base it around. There's been some different things. I hope you've enjoyed it, but we've talked about some things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have thought about. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about a history of burial of people, which is probably something that most of us have spent very little time thinking about. I know we've all been to numerous funerals, and even if we don't go all the time, we know sort of how a funeral works, but why is it like that? And I'd say that for most of us, we've never really spent much time thinking about it. And so we'll look a little bit about that here this evening. Let's talk first of all, though, about what we're going to be looking at tonight. This is our 11th lesson. And this miracle, because we're kind of following through these chronologically, this miracle follows the healing of the centurion servant, which we talked about last week. Nain is about 25 miles from Capernaum, 25 or 30 miles, kind of to the southwest. Everything I said, or everything I saw, said it was like 25 miles. But if you punch it in to walk or on a road, it's like 30 miles. So whatever there's a divide somewhere between them that you got to swerve around to get there. By the way, to drive from Capernaum to Nain is about 25 or 30 miles. It said it would take you today, if you drove that, about an hour and 5 minutes. So it's pretty heavily trafficked area, looked like a major road there within. Obviously, that road wasn't there when Jesus was around. I would imagine there would have been some kind of road, some kind of path, some kind of route that would have taken. But again, we look at where it is. This is the Sea of Galilee right here. Most of these early stages of Jesus's life are spent in Galilee right there. So this is, you can see here, you don't see Jerusalem on this map. Jerusalem is down about right here. It's much further south. There was movement back and forth, but a lot of Jesus's early teaching will be in Galilee. Nain is also near a town called Shunem, and that's the place where Elisha had restored life to the son of the Shunammite woman, 2 Kings chapter 4. This afternoon, I thought, I'm going to take a minute, look over my lesson, make sure it's good. Realized I had not put a scripture reading on the lesson. I realized why. My thought originally was we were going to read this, but verses 8 through 37, we might not have ever left if we had to read 30 verses before, so we chose one verse in Revelation instead. But we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. The third point there, Jesus comes into this city of Nain in Galilee. He encounters a funeral procession. A dead man was being carried outside the city for burial, and we'll talk more about that as well. So I wanted to hit on sort of 3 main points to start with. This will be our first, I guess this is the first time we'll see Jesus conduct a miracle that raised someone from the dead. We'll see that again, but it's not the first. We use the word restoration of something. And you here out of the left ear, so to bring back to its original state. Very good. So life being restored would mean to be bring back to its original state. There are three examples in the Old Testament. We're not going to look at them, but I would encourage you maybe to write them down, or if you've got your phone, just take a picture of each of those verses there. And if you've got a little time in the next few days or so, you can go back and read them. Most of them just a handful of verses. The first one, though, in the Old Testament, the son of the widow of Zarephath by Elijah. That's in 1 Kings. The Shunammite woman by Elisha in 2 Kings. And the man touching Elisha's bones. That's in 2 Kings as well. So all of those are sort of in that spot. In the New Testament, we see the story of the daughter of Jairus by Jesus. That's in Matthew chapter 9. That's listed first, but we've not got to that yet in our lessons. The son of the widow of Nain, which we'll talk about tonight. Lazarus by Jesus. That's probably the one that you're most when we think about these. Tabitha or Dorcas by Peter in Acts chapter 9, and Eutychus by Paul in Acts chapter 20. So 8 different ones. That does not include Jesus being resurrected, but that's a little different than what we're talking about here. One important point to think about here, every single one of these people that are listed, including the son of the widow of Nain, will die somewhere else down the line. Life restored, but not resurrected for all time. I don't know when these people died. It would have maybe been, a few years or many years, sometime down the line. But for whatever reason, they were brought or restored. But these are examples of it. And again, I would encourage you to maybe look back over these and just set them aside as a reading or something for the next couple of nights or what have you. I'll keep it up here for a second if you want to. But what would maybe be, and we don't have to speak to each of these specifically, but what would maybe be the reason for restoring someone back to life? Be it Elijah, Elisha, Jesus, whoever, Paul, Peter. What would be the reason for this? Might be needed, okay. There's no right or wrong answer on this. Sure. Right. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, Boo, because Lazarus, we'll talk about that here in a few weeks, whenever it is. But Lazarus would seem to be a really close friend of Jesus, right? Lazarus' sisters, who were Lazarus' sisters? We remember? Mary and Martha, who are mentioned quite often with Jesus. It seems like a close connected people. And that would have been a death that would have hurt Jesus, no doubt. But tonight we're going to look at somebody who is only in the Bible for 7 verses. I don't in our story tonight, or the young man, anybody in the Bible. Restoration of life is for somebody that was maybe near and dear, somebody that was loved, somebody that was a close friend. But in some cases, it was just somebody, right? And I think that's a good example maybe of what Ben was saying a minute ago about sort of a showing of power, that it was not limited to somebody that I like that person, so I want to help. It makes sense to me that Jesus would raise Lazarus. It doesn't necessarily make sense that Jesus would restore to life the son of the widow of Nain. But it also doesn't make sense to me that Jesus would go to the cross for our salvation, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense either. But it shows what Jesus was willing to do. And I think that's our sort of focus for this evening. Again, we'll see some of these again a little bit going forward. Let's talk about New Testament. I've called this New Testament burials, but really it was just sort of time period burials. And there's a few things here, and I want to hit on each of these. I should have made them a little bigger. In the time of Jesus, burial generally followed death quickly, and the burying place was always outside of the city. That's what we'll read about here in just a second. Like, that's a literal statement that says that they were taking him out the gate of the city. We'll come back to that, why it was outside of the city, here in a second. Body would be washed, anointed with spices, oils, wrapped in linen cloths with the head bound, typically in a separate cloth. Does that second bullet point sound familiar? What about that second bullet point sounds familiar to you? I mean, it's almost exactly the way we read about Jesus's burial. In fact, whenever they come to the tomb after Jesus had been resurrected, what do they see laying in the tomb? The wrappings are sort of folded up, right? Now, coffins, the way we think of coffins, were rarely used by Jewish people at this time. Now, in the reading, it will use the word coffin in the translation, but that was not typical. First of all, think about what a coffin would be made out of. Wood. And they lived in an area that was not necessarily overcome with forest. And so you didn't have a lot of wood accessible. We looked at homes the other day. A lot of those were sort of mud brick type homes. A better word is a bier or a litter. That is what both of these things are right here. This right here is a bier, B-I-E-R, but it's pronounced just like the drink. This might look familiar to you. We still use these in funeral homes today, right? This is where the casket sits there in the front, and they'll roll that out to the door, and then pallbearers will carry the casket onto the into the hearse or whatever. That is a bier. This is a litter, okay? L-I-T-T-E-R. It was simply something that would have been carried. This is kind of how I think about the man who was lowered down through the ceiling from a couple of weeks ago. He was probably in a litter. A bier is a much sturdier thing. You're limited to where you can go with this. This will allow you to move a little more distance and move into some other places. The body would be carried to the grave on an open bier or litter, again, situation. Funeral procession included not only relatives and friends of the deceased person, which sounds familiar to us, but also singers and mourners who were often hired for their services. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have ever been to a funeral where they ask you to sing, like a group congregation singing or whatever? How many of you maybe didn't even really know that person, but you maybe knew you were a friend of that person? Why did you go? Pay respect. You didn't know that person, but you cared for the other connection. Well, that's kind of what we see here. Singers and mourners, they were often hired for their service there as well. All right. Now, I do want to talk now for just a minute about something that is not scriptural, but if you'll give me a couple minutes, I want to talk about it. I've entitled this, The Evolution of Modern Burial, how we got to where we are right now. And this will mostly be focused on Europe. And I say that because most of America was settled by people who came from Europe. All right. But in Europe, and again, if you got questions, feel free to ask. But in Europe, burial was almost completely controlled by the church. Okay. How many of you have ever seen a church building with a cemetery in the back or to the side or, real close to it, right? That's pretty common. Okay. Initially, burials were in mass graves until the body decomposed. Now, a body will decompose pretty quickly, and I didn't look that up, but if you put a body underground in just a wrapping, it's going to decompose really quick. Those vaults and things that we put caskets down in today, it'll take a lot longer for those to decompose because they're airtight. But that stuff, everything inside that will eventually start to decompose. But these burials in these mass graves were decomposed. Then after the body decomposes, which doesn't take long for that flesh, the bone lasts a little longer. And so the bones would be removed and they were placed in ossuaries. We'll talk about that in a second as well, along the walls of the cemetery or sometimes under the floor of the church. So these bones were then moved out of the pit and into another spot. Now, how many of you think that seems a little odd? Okay. Moving bones from one to the other. Well, that was probably what would have happened to 99% of us. People of importance were often buried within the church itself with a full stone and inscription. Tell me who you think people of importance would be. Kings and queens, church leaders, ones they deemed people that were of some kind of high ranking. Now, I regret to inform you, most of us would have been tossed out in the pit just like about everybody else was back then. I hate to tell us on that. If you weren't important enough to be buried in the church, the next level of importance landed in the church yard. Okay? Now, why would they want important people buried in the church? They'll be there forever. Huh? Absolutely money. People would come and visit, and they would either pay to go into the church, which didn't happen a lot, but more about buying things there from the church along the way. But, yeah. And every single time I go to church, what am I going to see? I'm going to see whoever that is. Like now, we have people that unless you have somebody that's buried in your backyard, which is probably not too likely for most of us, we have to physically go to a cemetery to see where that stone is. We know they're there, but we don't necessarily go to the cemetery every single day. But when you walk into that church building, there's that big name there, whoever it was, and you'll remember who that person was as well. Now, there was a level of where you would get buried. And again, this is not scriptural. This is something that sort of led to where we live in today. Those of higher importance, the highest importance, were buried on the east side of the church, facing east. So you would see the sunrise. All right? That was the highest ranking of people. So if we had, imagine that the road and the bank's not there, and imagine the part's not here, what would be the east side of this building? Where are we at? Be over here, right? So the highest ranking people would be buried over there. All right? Now, the next best real estate was on the south side of the church. And so the church, the second best ranking, you're going to be out there. We wouldn't have those doors. The doors would have been here. Churches in Europe were laid out in a specific way. They all face the same direction because they were designed with these churchyards of importance. All right, this is an exact wording of what I saw. Indigents, unknown travelers, undesirables, and stillborn babies, among others, were buried on the north side of the church. So there was a clear definition of how people were buried in these places. If you could afford a headstone, you would get one, but most people couldn't. That's relevant to us even to this very day, right? What do you think you got if you couldn't afford a headstone? Wooden cross or a metal cross. In the United States, we see it quite often, just little stones. I know, Dad, you dealt with a lot of that at our family cemetery in the past, figuring out what does this sort of random square rock mean? Who does this represent? And those of you who have family cemeteries can probably relate to that as well. Now, over time, right up until the start of what we would say in the United States, Europe's population had been fairly low, but it explodes in the 17 and 1800s, 1700s especially. And this population explodes, dramatic increase in population. What happens if you have a much larger population? What happens to the churchyard burials? Start to run out of space, right? Start to run out of space. Not only that, they started to be outlawed because there were so many, and again, we're not using coffins, that stuff sort of seeps out. It would get into water. It was very unhealthy, a lot of disease and that kind of stuff as well. Think about flooding, how something like a flood would be a big problem. So what they started to do then, and what they continued to do, was take these bones and put them in catacombs. I should have got a picture, and I apologize for not. But in France, there were approximately 6 catacombs of France. They're, in a sense, really just skulls and bones in there. But think about, like, that's a lot of movement of the body after your death, right? That's a whole lot of that. So in the United States, this problem came to be solved by putting burial grounds outside of the city limits. Those of you that are here in Stanford, where is the city cemetery? It's a couple miles out the way, right? You know where it is in Lancaster? It's in town today. It wasn't in town when it was put there. It's on the backside between Richmond Street and Crab Orchard Street. On the town is encroached upon it there, as it were. But think about that when you drive through other towns and you see the city cemetery. There's a strategic placement of that as well. That's why also, if you go to churchyards in old cities, you ain't seen anybody buried there in about 150 years either, because they eventually ran out of space. Now, I wanted 5 minutes to talk about something that wasn't in the Bible. Thank you all for giving me that. Yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. All right. There's our picture for this week from a long, long time ago. You can find it in Germany if you're there. Wittenberg, Germany, which is where, speaking of Luther, which was where Luther was sort of hidden out while he was translating the Bible, while he was being pursued, as it were. This is our story for tonight, though, this widow's son from Nain. This happens in Luke chapter 7. It's verses 11 through 17, but I just want to look at the first 5 verses right now, and then we'll go a little further after that. Connie, do you care to read Luke 7, 11 through 15? All right. So there's a few things for us to look at right here. Again, at the beginning of our series of lessons, I don't want to get too deep into the how it worked. I don't know how the ability to raise somebody from the dead really works. And we can fuss and fight and debate about all that. But I want to think about more why it was done and what was sort of in maybe the heart of Jesus and the people that were around him at the time. So let's talk, first of all, though, the first question from the first verse. As Jesus goes into Nain, who was with him in verse 11? Disciples and what? What does that tell you about where we are with Jesus by this point? He's got a lot of followers, because most of Jesus's activity has been around Capernaum and it's been around the Sea of Galilee. But by this point, he's 25 miles away from sort of home base, but there's a whole lot of people with him. And this is a move of people that, I mean, if you're going to walk 25 miles with somebody, how's that going to affect your normal life? We're going to be gone for a while. That's what, we're trying to think about that. Like, if you're going to go this far of a distance, you're going to need a day or two off of work right there. And so Jesus has a lot of people with him at this time. Now, I do think sometimes we think about these stories only about the Jesus part. But you have to realize, like, the whole world is happening at the same time. Right now, you are in the church building, but there's 25 people here. There's 8 billion people in the world. What are those other 7,999,000. What are they all doing right now? Something else, right? Something else. And so just because Jesus is out moving, teaching, traveling, whatever, that doesn't mean that other things weren't happening. And so as Jesus is walking into the city, they cross paths here with a dead man. Luke chapter 7 and verse 12, how do they describe him? He's being carried out. He's his mother's only son. What else? And she was a widow. And what else? So there's a large crowd with them as well. So it wasn't just Jesus who had large crowds. There was other things happening in the world. So you have this sort of clump of people that are moving this way, and you have another clump of people who are moving that way. And what are they doing? Sort of crossing paths or coming together, as it were. And so Jesus then sees this burial, this funeral procession take place. Now, how would you describe the attitude? First of all, let's look at words first, attitude second. Luke 7 and verse 13. What does Jesus say? Because he doesn't say much. Do not weep. All right, 3 words, right? Weep not, it's only 2, depending on how old your English is on the translation. But do not weep. Now, those are pretty simple words to say. Now, how hard would it be for the woman and the people that were with her to do what Jesus said right there? She would have been inconsolable. And we'll get into that a little bit more later because that widow part is an important point as well. But Jesus says, do not weep. That seems like a tall task to ask of somebody. I mean, I have kids at school that sometimes cry, and they're crying about some random thing that doesn't even matter. And I was like, don't cry. You don't understand, Mr. Hopkins. You'll be all right. All right? But this is a situation where weeping is the right answer. But I want to then look then at verse 13. How did they describe Jesus' attitude as he is saying this? We read that he had pity, that he had compassion on her in this story. Now, this is one of a handful of parables. That's our Sunday morning thing with Will. A handful of miracles that's only recorded in one book. So it's possible that if John or Matthew or Mark had written this, there might have been a few more words added in. But clearly, this description of Jesus having compassion on this woman also goes along with what he says, do not weep. But that would be a difficult ask of a person. Now, Jesus doesn't stop there, though. What if he had said, do not weep? We're heading this way, see you that way. But instead, verse 14, after telling the woman to not weep, what does Jesus then say and do next in verse 14? So first thing, he touched the open coffin, the carrier, whatever it is that they're carrying it. And what are the people that are carrying it? What do? They say, so clearly something's about to happen right here. And then Jesus speaks for a second time in verse 14 saying what? Okay. Now, young man, I say to you, arise. Now there's a big difference in verse 14 and verse 13. Okay? Verse 13 is do not weep, but that's not really a solution to this problem. But there were probably a lot of people that died while Jesus was on the earth. And we looked and saw there were only a handful that were raised or restored. Only a couple or 3 with Jesus. So why do you think then that why does verse 14 exist? I think that's probably true. Other thoughts on it? What is verse? Sure. Okay. Nobody asked for anything. These are ships passing in the night. But I think that's important because this is the first time we see Jesus in Nain. And Jesus is coming. Where do you think this crossing of paths took place? So it's going to be on the edge of the city. So Jesus is 25 miles away in an area that I'm sure the word had spread, but those people that were there were not there for Jesus, right? They were there for the woman, for the son who'd passed away. They were there for the funeral. And so this is an opportunity for Jesus perhaps to do what? Kind of get a foot in the door in a place that he hadn't been to as well. Again, we're just thinking about, what would be the reason for doing whatever he would. I think all of those examples work, Ben. Uh-huh. Sure. And we said at the beginning, Nain is very close to Shunem. Jesus was clearly pretty well schooled in the old law. Whenever you drive, Mary sometimes gets mad at me when we do this. We drive by something, and I'll tell her some kind of story about what happened in that place. And when the story's finished, like, I don't know who any of those people are. And I'm like, well, you do know, because he is this. I don't know who that is, but she was this. You get that. You start. Well, I'm sure that all of us can relate to that. But Jesus was in an area where, he might have even been thinking this. And this is, who knows? But he might have been thinking this is where Elisha was as well. What happened to the dead man? That's an interesting verse 15. So he sets up and does what? Sets up and begins to speak. And then Jesus does what? This is about the closest that we get, in my opinion, to Jesus sort of doing a ta-da, right? Like, I don't know that that's what it is, but this is about as close as you can get. Like, he has clearly raised this son, and then he turns and sort of shows to this mother what has been done. Now, how do you think? Well, hold on to that. Let's look at verses 16 and 17. Jimmy, do you care to read 16 and 17? All right. So I want us to keep verses 16 and 17 in mind for this question. We've had a similar question before with miracles, but this is one that maybe is a little even more over the top. What was the reaction of the people? Let's just start in verse 16, and I want to go almost like sentence by sentence how the people reacted. The first part of verse 16 says what? Fear came upon all. Now, when we use the word fear here, what does the word fear mean? Wonderment. I don't know if it means scared necessarily, but I think sometimes scared and wonderment work together. It's almost like, whoa, what am I seeing right here? But clearly, when we read fear God and keep his commandments, that I shouldn't be scared to death that God's going to strike me dead. But by the same token, I have a recognition of God being sort of up here. And so it says fear comes over them. Go ahead. Probably so. But all of them, it says fear came upon all. you're definitely sort of stepping back. What's the second part then? After that, what do we see? They glorified God right here. So they realized by this point, there's enough known about Jesus that he was clearly capable of stuff that really nobody else was. You've also got a mingling of crowds here because you've got the Jesus crowd and you've got the widow of Nain crowd that are probably crossing paths with each other. And I'm sure there might have been some people as this story has taken place that might have been in the widow of Nain crowd and been like, who is this guy, right? And then there might have been people in the Jesus crowd that was like, you got to see this guy, right? There's probably some of that taking place as well. All right, how did they describe Jesus? A great prophet has risen up among us. He's come from us, not from some far off place, but sort of right here in this place or this town. God has visited his people. Now let's go to verse 17. Because quite often in our miracle study, Jesus has sort of finished the miracle by telling people what? Don't tell, keep it to yourself, go back to the whatever it might be. What happens in verse 17? Everybody told everybody. And I think we're at a point here for Jesus that you're probably just wasting your breath telling people, don't go out and tell this because everybody's going to tell it, right? You're going to go out. And it says, report about him went through all Judea and all of the surrounding region as well. All right. Thoughts on this miracle? Sure. That's how John ends. It's exactly right. Have we seen crowd reactions like this to the miracles of Jesus? Right. Right. Sure. Right. Sure. Is it possible for too many miracles to become commonplace for the people? What does commonplace mean right there? So commonplace is an ordinary, something happens all the time. Just, we go eat at McDonald's every Tuesday morning at 9. That's a commonplace kind of thing, right? So I want us to seriously think about this question for just a minute. Can too many miracles become commonplace for the people? Yeah, that's a really good example. What else? Wasn't that incredible? That's okay. That's on TV. Yeah. It was not the show. That was not, and that's where I wanted to get at right there with this last little bit here was that I think it probably could become. But now, with that said, Boo, what you said a minute ago, we don't know how many things were done, and you'll never know the answer to that. But I think this set of answers here have been good. Other thoughts on that last question? Yeah, I think that's true. You and we're greatly appreciative of that. Right. Couple things to go home with. Number one, God knows and understands the details of our situation. I put situation in quotations right there. Now, this woman had previously lost her husband because it describes her as a widow. She's now lost her son, and she's certainly probably thinking about all of that as they progress to the burial site. And I'm sure with this being her only son and her husband already being dead, the thought that's going through her mind is, how am I going to survive, right? How am I going to be able to make it? This would have ruined her economically, whatever economic situation she had. It's probably a lot worse than there. She would have been at the mercy of her neighbors. Mom, you mentioned that, the people that were traveling with her there. But I can't help but think that her future was extremely dark 3 minutes before Jesus and his crew rounds the corner. Well, all of us have our situations, right? We all have our situations. A lot of times people know it, but sometimes they don't. But who does know? God knows, right? And so if God knows and we trust that God can fix that, what do we need to do with our situation? And that's difficult. But I can turn it over to you, but you probably can't fix it. But God understands the details of it. Number two, I think when we hurt, God hurts. And I think we see that with Jesus right here. In the reading, it said that Jesus was moved with what? Moved with compassion when he saw her. So when we ask if Jesus was God in human form, how human was he? Well, I think compassion is a human emotion, definitely, right? There's compassion that we have. That's why he went to the cross, right? That's who Jesus was. So what should we do to be like that? Well, we feed the hungry, right? Tend to the sick, visit those in prison, perhaps clothe the naked, help the homeless, the vulnerable, support the weak. We can come up with all kinds of things in ways that we should strive to help, right? Now, sometimes that help sort of falls on deaf ears, or sometimes that help is not accepted. Jesus stops those people who were carrying that casket. But they could have said, no, we're going on, right? They could have just moved right on from that. But clearly, there was compassion there from Jesus. The third one, compassion is more than sympathy. There's a difference between the two, and sometimes this gets confused from people. But it seems like that when Jesus sees this woman, he felt her pain in that situation, right? But not only did he realize that she was hurting, but he also did something about it. Which one is sympathy and which one is compassion? Sympathy is feeling the pain, right? When you all announce on Wednesday nights of somebody that's sick or hurt or in the hospital, there's a level of sympathy that I have, but almost immediately I think, I don't know who that person is. I've never heard of that name. But should we be sympathetic or should we be compassionate? We should strive to be compassionate. But sometimes I think we let sympathy sort of carry the day, right? Absolutely. Yeah. Sure. Absolutely. It is. Well, and what's the people that are closest to us, obviously, you do have that. When we have compassion, that pain, that sorrow, whatever it is that weighs on us so much that it's like, I have to do something about this. Well, that's sometimes hard to do, in part because what do? You ever known somebody whose situation was bad and you've uttered a sentence that said, I don't even know what to do? We've probably all uttered that sentence at some point because there's really not maybe anything. But Jesus had the ability to help out the situation that the woman was facing, right? He had that ability to sort of fix that for her. Yeah. It's a difficult, it's a difficult situation. And sometimes those situations are spur of the moment, but sometimes they lasted for years and years. And that becomes really difficult. Obviously, the widow at Nain, that was just sort of a happenstance kind of thing. But we know a lot of widows of Nain, but we also know a lot of situations like Linda's, where maybe we have tried to help, and that's just I don't know what the right answer is. Yeah, but that it's a difficult it's a difficult thing. I wish I had an answer for you, Linda, but I don't think I have one. I don't think anybody in this room has one for that. That would be really difficult. But those three things, lessons to take with us to leave and strive for. I try for these three things to always be something that can maybe help us as we go forward, and hopefully that can be as well. Any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up? No clue if that would be true or not. But Ben, I think there's some truth to the fact that sometimes we see others in things that we see. Things remind us of other things. And I think sometimes we might be willing to help in a situation because it reminds us of maybe another situation that somebody who maybe was close to us, this person's not, but this one is. And, I know somebody who's been through that or whatever. That might be a more willingness to help in those situations. So, Ben, I'd say it's not the same, but I think we all sort of have those things that trigger those sort of thoughts in our heads as well. Anything else before we wrap up? Thank you much.